Thank you everyone for having us here. Thank you, ma'am. So, before I begin our conversation, let me show you the two wonderful books that I really suggest that you go right away and get yourself a copy, because these are extremely timely, extremely well written, and extremely informative books about some of the political and cultural realities and situations of Nepal, which is our neighboring nation, a landlocked nation, a nation that, to quote, a nation that's between India and China, and therefore has sometimes been called the buffer state between the two nations. And we see this constantly, this idea that perhaps I'm going to leave that question up to them, do you think of Nepal as a buffer state between India and China? And does that kind of play into the perception we have of Nepal's political, cultural and geopolitical reality between the two nations of India and China? So I will leave that to you.
Well, thank you, Smriti, and it's really wonderful to be here with Amish, and we're delighted to have General Deshpande and his wife. General is the commanding officer of 2 mountain based here, and we have also Jayanto. Jayanto was the Director General of Police of Assam, so we're really honored to have such a distinguished participation with all the students. You know, it makes you feel very young, so it's good to be with young people. And my panelists, my fellow panelists, are really representatives of both countries, because both of them are Nepalese but married to Indians. So, you know, we really have a great understanding of each other's countries. To come to the question of Nepal as a buffer state and China, I think, you know, historically that is the way India or the British and thereafter independent India did look at Nepal. Also partly because of the relationship between India and China, and so Nepal's strategic location becomes extremely critical. But I think with modern technology and contemporary geopolitics, you know, some of these concepts are also undergoing a major transformation. So, you know, it's not easy to give you a straightforward answer. But yes, certainly there is that element in the thinking of policymakers, let's say, about, you know, it's not Nepal as such, but the Himalayas as a whole. I think Amish in his book has shown how actually there was a lot of interaction across the Himalayas. So, you know, this is one way of looking at it, but, you know, there are many other ways of looking at reality. I think as the professor said, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. So, you know, there are many ways of looking at everything. So yes, that is one aspect certainly that is in the minds of policymakers, at least.
So you just talked about how the borders of the border that Nepal shares with India and the border that Nepal shares with Tibet and with China has really impacted its cultural and political reality. And in your book, the border becomes a very living space where you travel to it and you talk about the historical development of, you know, the historical relationship that Nepal has had with Tibet, and therefore also with China, both of trade and of culture. This is not something that we talk about much in this part of the world. We always talk about cultural relationship between India and Nepal, but not about India and China so much, or Nepal and China so much, or Nepal and Tibet so much. Do you want to enlighten us about it a little more?
Thank you, Smriti. Thank you, the organizers, for having me. It's quite lovely being in such a young crowd, like Ranjit sir said. Just building up both on your question as well as what sir said, the idea of a buffer state is obviously a very, very, let's say, an imperial idea, right? Like to have something that, and like sir said, it's one of the ways of looking. And I think what I try to do in my writing is to show that there are other ways that are perhaps more relevant even today. The idea of this understanding the Himalaya as this living space where people have been constantly mobile. Like mobility is one of the few sort of outstanding, let's say, aspects of living in the mountains, of living in the Himalayas. And I don't think that has been represented enough. And that was one of the goals when I started writing this book, to look at the Himalayas. How is it possible to look at the Himalayas as not just a barrier, but perhaps as, like you said, you defined it very well, as a living space, and in fact, we know that there have been migrations across the Himalayas. We know that there have been migrations both from Nepal into India, India into Nepal, Nepal into eastern, let's say the northeast, Nepal into western India. All of these places, we've seen a lot of these spaces happening, right? Tibetans moving over. So I think these aspects of the relationship, they often get overlooked in favor of the security aspect. And for obvious reasons, because security obviously dominates, the sort of the political history of the subcontinent. But to be such closely connected people, to be such culturally linked, not just religion but also economically, familiarly, both of us, we have family on both sides of the border. I think those aspects don't come out in the way we look at just, let's say, these spaces, these sort of like regions. The entire Himalayan region is a space where we're constantly interacting with each other in some way or the other. But why is that not reflected in how we look at it? So I think that is one of the efforts that I tried to put in the book. And I think you're absolutely right in that to look at the popular dimension of, let's say, the popular way of looking at Nepal has always been that, all right, you look at it as basically upwards from India, right? But I argue that that is, again, just one way of looking at it. And that also assumes that the Himalaya was this barrier. So the contact from India into Nepal does not go forward into Tibet. And that did not happen. Because you can see this through history. I mean, you have pilgrims, you have monks, you have soldiers, you have traders, Kashmiri Gosai, like Kashmiri traders, Gosai monks. Everyone has been going up and down these mountains. And I don't think that idea has been reflected enough in literature. And that was one of the points that I tried to do in the book, to show this multidimensional character of the way we have, let's say, our history tells us.
It was fascinating actually to read about that aspect, because even when you live, even though I grew up in Nepal and I am from Nepal, most of the conversations, and I'm from the Madhesi community, so that makes it a little more tricky. And anyway, so most of the conversation you hear are about the cultural ties between India and Nepal, at least from the Indian side of, where I have family in India, they will all say, oh, Nepal and India are so similar, why we are both Hindus, and there is this undercurrent of India and Nepal are so similar that any kind of a rift seems unnatural. And yet, your book talks about how strong the rift can get. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the affinities between India and Nepal, the cultural affinities, and yet the political dissonance sometimes that exists simultaneously?
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. But before I get on to that, I just want to make one comment, taking off from what Amish said. You see, this concept of the modern Westphalian state had very hard borders, and that's a new development. Historically, if you look at borderlands of India, they were totally fluid. People were moving across borders, people didn't even know what their nationality was, and you had communities living. You look at it everywhere. I mean, look at, between Manipur and Myanmar, or, of course, between India and Nepal, that border is still very open and fluid. But so there were these very fluid and sort of shifting, a very nebulous kind of border. They were not hard borders. So hard borders only came with, the modern nation state, where your territorial sovereignty became very important, and where you had to protect your borders. And so that's how this whole, imperial concept and the idea of a buffer state and so developed. Now coming to your question on, there is so much similar in terms of religion, language, culture, between India and Nepal, and yet the political relationship sometimes is very fraught. And I think, this is something you have to look at it from a Nepali perspective. Sitting in Nepal, it's a small country of 30 million people. And if you're sitting in Nepal and, looking south, you see this huge country of 1.5 billion people. And I don't know how many times the size in terms of geographical area. And for Nepal, India surrounds it on 3 sides. And in the north, they're bounded by the Himalayas. And Bhutan is also in a similar sort of geographical situation. So that's one aspect. So when they see this, really large country, it's, in my book I say there's this kind of claustrophobic embrace of India that Nepal wants to sort of, it feels a little uncomfortable with. And then, the second factor is this commonality of culture, language, religion. So, what is then the identity of Nepal? If everything is the same or is similar to India, then what is the USP of Nepal? What is the unique national identity of Nepal? And that's why things like, the Buddha was born in Nepal, or Mount Everest in Nepal are such strong symbols of Nepalese national identity. So in a sense, Nepal tries to define itself as distinct from India. So I think, one needs to understand this psychology and sentiment. If I were a Nepali, perhaps I would have a similar mindset. And so I used to tell our political leaders and others visiting, it's all very well to say, roti beti ka rishta, and we have very similar and so on. But it doesn't necessarily go down so well in Nepal. And wait for the Nepalese to say this, rather than, you saying it. Because, our saying it becomes a little patronizing, big and so on. So this is, so in a sense, and what I'm now going to say doesn't relate to all of Nepal, but certain elements in Nepal, and certainly the leftist elements in Nepal or the royalist elements in Nepal, defined their national identity as something distinct from India, or as some people say, you developed your national identity vis-a-vis or versus India. And so India is very much present in the concept of national identity of Nepal. And, so which is why Nepal has always tried to seek greater political space. We talk about India constantly wanting strategic autonomy. So it's very much the same in Nepal. 2/3 of their trade is with India, their access to the rest of the world is with India, so they want to diversify. So I think this sentiment India needs to understand. And because of these issues, sometimes the political relationship also becomes complicated, because there are not just 2 people in this relationship. There's also China, which looms very large in the north. And as Amish has very provocatively called his book, All Roads Lead North, when all roads actually lead south.
Actually, sorry, I just wanted to build on that. I think absolutely, that's the absolute, you're absolutely correct in how, let's say, the Nepali national identity is defining itself, politically, the nationalism, right? It defines itself as not being part of Nepal, not being part of India, or not being similar to India. I think it is also an outcome of a construct that is deliberate, right? It is because you see, what exactly do we say when we say that culturally similar? I mean, you can argue that it's culturally similar up to a point, but as you climb the hills and the more you go into the mountains, you will find, of course, the similarities are not with what we call the southern border or UP and Bihar, but increasingly you will find that, for instance, someone living in, let's say, Mustan, which is a trans-Himalayan region, will have more in common with Ladakh. So those sort of similarities, I don't think we look at it enough in a sort of a comprehensive manner. We sort of look at these issues of identity, of how we construct our own identity in silos. And I don't think we are doing enough to sort of look at it in a more comprehensive manner, to think at identity not just as a, let's say, not as a silo, but more as a amorphous idea that, all right, you're taking in something from here, you're taking in something from somewhere else, and that's how your identity gets built over the years, right? Like over history, over like time.
Actually, when both of you were speaking, I'm sitting here and I'm listening to this conversation as a Madhesi, and I'm thinking, when you were speaking, I'm thinking your understanding of Nepal as a population that is trying to define itself as distinct from India is the population that you are talking about, which actually sees itself as distinct from India. Whereas the population that I am is constantly struggling to say, hey, but I am similar. How do I manage to say with respect and keeping my own identity intact that I am similar and yet distinct?
I think you have to tell who the Madhesis are.
Okay, so Nepal, of course, has two borders, the north and the south. The southern border it shares with India, and the northern border it shares with Tibet and China. And the southern border is populated by people who have cultural affinity with India and also who look like me, so are often asked questions like, oh, when did you migrate to Nepal? And then you have to say, no, I am Nepali, I did not migrate to Nepal, which never makes sense to anyone. They will keep asking you that question. Then when you go to Kathmandu, where many of them will look like Amish, people will ask you, oh, you are from India. And then you say, no, I'm from Janakpur. And some people will even go ahead and say, but isn't that in India? It's very similar to how people in Darjeeling face their identity here. It's the same struggle that you face all the time. And so I think the people who are trying, perhaps a part of the population that tries to make itself distinct is the population that sees the distinction. But the other part of the population, like me, struggle with that and have struggled with it all our life. And you come to Kathmandu, my book, The Woman Who Climbed Trees, actually talks about an Indian woman who marries a Nepali boy, a Madhesi boy, because she's been told all her life that India and Nepal to ek hi hota hai. Ek hi bhasha, ek hi kya hai, Maithili idhar, so like that. But then she moves into Kathmandu and is distinct. The food is distinct, the architecture is distinct, the art is distinct, the language. She has a Newari friend, she can't understand a word of it. And she's been told all her life that marrying in Nepal is like marrying into another state in India, but it's not. And I think Amish's book really talks about that and talks about the distinction that it can very strongly have from India. Though I would like you to talk about the title of your book, All Roads Lead North.
No, so, see, the thing is, there are two ways of thinking about it. My convenient answer is that it made you notice the book. So it's got its job done. But the second part of it is, I mean, a lot of my book is involved, I traveled a lot in the Himalayan borderlands. I'm just trying to get a sense of, because this is after 2015, so when the Indian blockade happened and what India calls and does not call a blockade, but we call a blockade. So then after that, there was this drastic rise of China's involvement in Nepal. And for obvious reasons, because China was seen as an alternative, China was seen as this political and economic alternative to India, and therefore there was a lot of excitement in Nepal about how do we expand relations with China, how do we diversify our relations with China, right? And one of the first, like the most important markers of that are the roads that are actually leading north. And for instance, the first road, and this is a motorable road that I'm talking about, not a, like, let's say a footpath, right? Like, no, not a track. The first road, when it was built in the 1960s, Mahendra, who was the nationalist king, he had to actually say that, his famous quote is that communism does not come in a taxi cab. And I argue that communism actually came by road. Because the road from Lhasa to Kathmandu, it brought with it, of course, the Maoist version, the Maoism, quite a bit of Maoist literature, all of that. But now what we are seeing is from the Nepali side, At that time, it was the Chinese who were mostly insisting that, like, all right, let's build this road from Lhasa to Kathmandu. Now it is the Nepalis who are insisting on building more roads to Tibet, connecting to Tibet. And they are envisioning a Nepal where north-south corridors are across the nation. So you have currently about 3 or 4 road corridors, north-south corridors planned. Nepal is seeing itself as a transit state between India and China, where it can benefit out of the economic growth of both countries. Big neighbors, fastest growing economies in the world. Of course Nepal wants to benefit. And the way it sees that is that it wants to build roads to the north. It wants to build more roads to the north. And I was sitting on the back of a bike, freezing, going to a pass which is like about 4,800 meters. And that was when it struck me that everyone in Nepal is looking north right now. Everyone wants to build that road, everyone wants to see a highway, and some of them also want to see a train. So that bit, I think, like I said, that is why I think the roads are leading north.
How far along are we with this train thing? Because that is something. A train coming all the way to Kathmandu.
It's possible, it's expensive. We don't have the money. So if
China
China wants
has
to
the
build
money.
it.
So,
To me, it seemed unlikely.
yeah, you think?
Well, yeah, for both environmental reasons and cost effectiveness and viability. Because this is a big ticket project, will cost billions of dollars, and there are a lot of technological and environmental issues that will have to be resolved, and then finance. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why a country like China would want to put billions of US dollars into this project, which has no seeming economic returns, unless it connects to the Indian markets.
I was going to say, if it comes all the way to Kathmandu, doesn't that mean it's closer to the Indian market? And as a diplomat, how do you feel about the fact that Chinese roads are really looking to get lead more and more in the Nepali land?
See, I mean, I've also traveled on the Nepal-Tibet border, not as much as AMISH has. But it's a very treacherous border, and I'm sure the general has been there. And I remember after the 2015 earthquake, how that whole area was affected. So, while, technology can achieve a lot of things, I'm not so confident or sanguine that you will have, large container trucks rolling down these mountain fastnesses and roads. So I think it's a little bit of looking way ahead, far into the future. So I think a lot of it is psychological. It creates this ambience and feeling that in Nepal, for instance, we have other options, and some of it is also to cater to domestic political requirements and sentiments. But when you come to the hard nuts and bolts reality, it's not so easy. Of course, the road connections will come, and maybe some transmission lines along the roads. But to see China replacing India as the biggest partner of Nepal, I think is a pipe dream. I don't think that sort of thing will happen. Of course, on the margin, things will change and improve. But before there was one point that I did want to mention, not about China, but on the Madhesi issue. So see, when Nepal looks at its national identity as distinct from India, we say their nationalism kind of anti-Indian nationalism. And then you have this large chunk of people who live in the plains, in the Tarai Madhes. These are people who look like Indians. Many Nepalese think they are Indians, they've come from India. And then you don't have a good relationship with India because you define your nationalism as sort of anti-India. Then you conflate these citizens of your own country, the people living in the Tarai, as Indians, and if you don't like Indians or you feel threatened by Indians, then you feel that these citizens of your own country are perhaps, have divided loyalties. Maybe they, so that creates problems, and that is one of the reasons. This is, I think, one of the very deep fault lines in Nepal. And Amish referred to the so-called blockade of 2015. It was partly because the Madhesis were protesting very vigorously against what they saw was a non-inclusive constitution, or which didn't recognize the concept of regional identities in the sort of demarcation of federal provinces. And so there was a lot of turmoil and protest during which the new constitution was drafted. So this adds a complicating dimension which which the Nepalese of India don't face. They don't have this kind of issue that the Madhesis in Nepal face, or the Tamils of Sri Lanka used to face earlier. The Tamils of Sri Lanka also had a similar issue like the Madhesis.
No, I think the Madhesi dilemma and the Madhesi complication in Nepal is probably the most complicated issue, and the least, outside of Nepal, least recognized and talked about. Because I think, as we were talking this morning, and the Indian policy often of saying, well, it's an internal matter, how do we interfere with that? It's a Nepal matter. But then something like the blockade comes along, and India has been saying that it's not a blockade that was supported by India, whereas all of Nepal continues to say that it was a blockade supported by India, and the rift has been huge. So what are the possible, I don't know, how do we bridge these gaps? What can our political leaders do for this?
Amish?
No, I'll leave the politics to you. But I think I was just having a chat with ma'am in the morning in the bus, and I think, and this is not just Nepal, right? Like, I think across the Himalayan region and a large part of the subcontinent also, what has happened is that we have allowed modern political, let's say, ideologies, modern political, let's say, thought concepts to sort of build a framework of what our history has been. And because the politics aligns with a certain idea of history, that is the history that gets promoted, right? That gets encouraged. But if you really look at, like I said, the interactions that we have had, that histories can have a template for the future. What Sir is talking about, the idea of a fluid border, right? Like, the India-Nepal border is perhaps one of the few borders in the world today where you see how borderlands existed before the modern Westphalian system. And that is incredible in itself. I can go across, I remember going to, let's say, Gangtok. I flew out to Bhadrapur in eastern Nepal, just literally drove across to Siliguri, and I was in India. And it was simply a matter of showing that, all right, my driving license also works. So there's simple little things like that where the border is still very, very fluid. And I know that, in the Madhes also, you have rice fields in one part of the country, a rice field is in India, you're living in Nepal. And earlier that was a lot of people, in fact, used to, now of course they've all sold, a lot of people I believe have sold their properties across the border and everything, but that is how things used to be. And I think that this idea of the open border, that is the India-Nepal border, I think that is one of our most precious aspects. I don't think that is appreciated or encouraged enough. And I think that also holds a template for the future. I think we have to learn from how these historical connections helped us not just build our identities, but also helped our countries, helped our people, interact with each other. A simple example that I can give you is, and I have to go back all the way to the 7th century, and this is from Assam. One of Kathmandu Valley's most popular festivals, which goes on for a whole month. It's now called Machanana, but we call it Bungadia, which is also an avatar of Avalokiteshwar. So he's a Hindu god, he's a Buddhist god, and he is a local god as well. He is said to have been brought to Nepal from Kamrup, which is Assam. So I'm going back all the way 1300 years ago, and that is the connection that we can sort of draw out of these connections. So politically, yes, there is always some sort of a incentive to do things a certain way, to build certain narratives of history. But as non-political people, let's say non-state actors, like we can look beyond these frameworks.
So what can be done to improve the relationship? I think we need more engagement, across the board engagement, because Nepal today is not the same Nepal that we knew 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It's a very young society, aspirational, like India is. A lot of people leave the country to work abroad, they've made homes abroad. So it's a society that's also changing very rapidly. And this is something that India needs to be aware of, and we need to tailor our policies and our engagement and interaction, and target elements of society. Earlier, you had sort of interaction with political parties largely, or the government and so on, but it needs to be much more than that. And you really have to engage the people. And I think that's happening. So I think the only way you can resolve issues is through more engagement, more understanding, more conversation, more discussions, more study. You'd be surprised that a country like India, a big country, and we don't have a single center for the study of, say, Nepal. I mean, there was the Nepal Center at the Banaras Hindu University, which is more or less defunct. So, a country like India, and we don't really study our neighboring societies with the kind of depth and intensity that is required. So I think basically, there are a lot of things we can do, but more engagement, I think, is the sort of answer in one sentence.
I'm going to go back to the books for some time, because, these are both brilliantly written books and some very, very interesting episodes that happen, things that, historical, just the histories that are talked about, or the associations that are discussed were fascinating. So I would, Amish, do you want to tell us a little bit about your own personal experiences in these borderlands?
I don't know where to start. I think it's the first is obviously it's very cold, very, very, very windy. But yeah, I think see, one of the things about the Himalaya is that we are talking about this in the morning. A lot of what we learn from the Himalaya is usually written by people who are not from the Himalaya, right? So we get a view of the Himalaya that is very, very either outdated, or it fits a certain notion of the Himalaya as this, blank space that there are just mountain peaks and you go for trekking and you go for camping, you go for mountaineering, and that's it, right? You don't look at it as a living space, right? And I think in my travels, actually, it was an eye-opener to me too, because I'll give you one example, and this is relevant here, particularly here, is that in Mustang is a monastery which is from the 8th century. It is considered to be as old as, so Tibet has a monastery called Samye, and Samye is considered to be the oldest monastery in Tibetan Buddhism, which is from the 8th century. This monastery, Logekar, is said to be built at the same time as Samye. Logekar is also where Guru Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche, again Bhutan, comes from Swat in Pakistan, emerges out of a lotus in Himachal, flies to Bhutan, flies to Kathmandu, then goes to Tibet. He's the Superman of the Himalaya, right? So this monastery has one prayer wheel. Recently, I think it was built about, I just have to check my notes, but it was built about not more than 10 years ago. And there's a massive prayer wheel donated by the Mustang Dibrugarh Sweater Association. So what we have is Himalayan people all the way from Mustang. Every winter they come down, they buy sweaters in Ludhiana, they come all the way to Assam, to Dibrugarh, and they sell them here. And after the winter ends, they go back home to Mustang. So you can see these sort of connections. Where are the stories? Where are the histories? And that is the sort of connection that I'm looking at. That is the sort of connection that I'm arguing for, that's saying that why are we looking at the Himalaya as this barrier? Jawaharlal Nehru called it magnificent, India's magnificent frontier. But as soon as we talk about this notion of a frontier essentially limits our imagination completely. It does not allow us to think beyond, we look at it as a very, okay, there's a line, there are mountain peaks, and no one can cross them, no one can traverse them. I don't think that has ever been true in history. I don't think it will ever be true in the future as well. And I think this is one aspect of, at least from my travels, that is one thing that was really eye-opening to me.
And as the ambassador, you were telling us the story of when you were 3 hours late and what happened to you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how your tenure as an ambassador was in Nepal?
Well, I mean, that will take forever, but I'll just give you 2 incidents. And of course, everyone, and it is a fact that, the people of the Tarai of what is called Madhes, are very closely related to and similar to the people living in UP and Bihar. And so it's natural, it's the same people in a sense culturally. So there's a lot of affection for the Indian ambassador or representatives of the government of India, and partly it's also linked to the fact that in their own country there's a perception that they're discriminated against, for the reasons that I've already explained. So it's a very friendly, warm relationship, which obviously the government and the political leaders in Kathmandu are very touchy about, naturally. But I was in Janakpur. Janakpur is very famous as the land of Sita, and there is a beautiful Janki temple which was built by the Maharani of Orcha not very long ago, I think probably 19th or early 20th century. So they had this massive farewell for me when I was leaving, and for some reason I'm normally not late for appointments, but I was 3 hours late, and this was held in the Janki temple, and there were thousands of people, and it was just amazing. It was such a beautiful experience, but so unexpected. As a bureaucrat or a diplomat, you don't expect this kind of response from the people. And one story I want to tell you about the northern border. This is the Korla border between Mustan and Tibet, and this is actually the famous route that the Karmapa took to flee Tibet. And the general perception is that the people of the Tarai are very close to India and the Indians. But I found exactly the same experience on the Tibetan border. The last village in Nepal is a place called Chosar. And it's a small Buddhist community that lives there. It's about, maybe 18 or 20 kilometers from the Korla Naka, the Korla border, which is very fenced, and you have Chinese patrols, and very different from the border with India. People feel scared actually to go there. But the people of that last village, who one would reckon that are very close to the Tibetans and the Chinese, I mean, they were so enthusiastic in terms of receiving the Indian ambassador, and this Buddhist connection is so precious, and they cherish it so much, and you're seen as representing the land of Buddha's enlightenment and his karma bhumi. So it was such a beautiful experience. So I think at the level of the people of Nepal, wherever you go, whether it's the plains or the high Himalayas, there's a lot of warmth and friendship for India. The problem arises only in the political relationship, which is, a function of many other factors, and also regional politics, geopolitics, domestic politics. And so it gets tied up in all that. But I think, the basic foundation for our relationship is the relationship between the peoples. And there may be ups and downs, but it's a very solid foundation, which I don't really think can be shaken by any political leader.
So this session is called People, Palace and Politics. We've talked about people, we've talked about politics, we've not talked about palace at all. And both the books talk about the role that the palace has had in shaping the relationship historically with China and with India. And so I'm going to, Amish, you want to talk about some of the ways in which the palace has created and maintained relationships with China and Tibet?
So, I mean, it is, the palace is no more.
Is no, I guess.
Hopefully, and will continue to be so.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Because I was in, where was I? Where had I gone? I had gone somewhere. Oh my God, I was somewhere. And the palace came up, and I said, well, the palace is no more. And there was a resounding, I hope it comes back. And I said, what? No, we really fought hard for this. Please do not say such things. And I think that's where we sometimes see the inability to understand the reality of another nation. Because we were talking about how the palace is no more, and there was this resounding, oh, I hope it comes back. Because with the palace, Hinduism has gone away. And I said, we really fought hard to be a secular nation, and do not wish it back on us. And then they all said, you don't understand anything. So these are the way, I think this is where studying and having a real understanding of your neighbor becomes an important part of the relationship you build with that neighbor. Right? I'm sorry.
No.
Please go ahead.
I think, no, you raised a very important point, I think, but I'll ask Sir to build more on that, on like the palace and India. But I think, see, there are, of course, there is an idea that the identity of Nepal was very closely connected with the royalty, right? I would argue that the Nepali identity is a lot more diverse and a lot stronger than just the palace allowing it, like, giving it legitimacy. I think that is an outdated notion. I don't think we need kings anymore, because when the king was there, perhaps he was good to people around him, perhaps, I mean, I was quite young, but from what I remember, and also from what I have read, I think Nepal, when it had a monarchy, it was a very, very different state. It was a state that cultivated a particular identity that was hill-oriented, that defined itself as not Indian, what Sir was saying. So this entire idea of what we call Nepali nationalism, the roots of that lie in the monarchy's own idea of how they perceive Nepal to be as one nation, one people, one language. And that is entirely untrue, because just census alone tells us that there are more than 108 ethnic groups in Nepal, and there are about 120 languages inside Nepal today. So with such diversity in a country of 30 million people, which is the size of 30 million people, by the way, I checked, it's just a little bit less than the population of Assam. It's so much diversity, you continue to promote one language, one sort of dress as a national dress, one uniform, one people. Of course it will be challenged. Of course there will be fault lines that you're going to develop. And if you offer only this nationalism as an alternative to these fault lines, you will not be able to sustain yourself. And I think that is what happened with the monarchy. They simply, basically, to summarize it, I think they are just too outdated with the ideas of what the modern nation state should be like.
So, this is a very interesting issue about the monarchy, and there's a very strong belief in certain sections of Nepal that India had something to do with the elimination of the monarchy in Nepal, and that's not true. It's the people of Nepal that decided that they didn't want the monarchy anymore, and there are reasons for that. I think there were a lot of missteps on the part of the monarchy, especially after the Royal Palace massacre of 2001, when King Birendra and virtually his entire family was killed, and the next king who took over was King Gyanendra, and it was during Gyanendra's time that there was this Maoist insurgency that had been going on for quite some time, and some 17,000 people have been killed over a 10-year period. And that is the time when the king decided to also, take over all executive power. and basically decided that you didn't need political parties, the leaders were incompetent, and so the king would rule directly. As a result of which, the Maoists and the political parties, both of which felt that both of which turned against the king, decided to collaborate. And that led to a new dynamic in Nepal, which basically culminated in the overthrow of the monarchy, actually by the parliament. I mean, the parliament adopted a resolution abolishing monarchy. So it's really, it's not that India was involved in it. It's something I think that the people of Nepal had wanted, and partly as a result of the missteps taken by the king. And I agree with what Amish said. This whole concept of, I talked about this in a whole chapter. My first chapter in the book is called "Why Don't They Like Us?" In this chapter I talk about the role of the monarchy, and actually King Mahendra, who's recognized as a great leader of Nepal, also overthrew monarchy in 1960 and took over all executive power and introduced a non-partyless sort of parliament, panchayat system. And that was opposed by India. Pandit Nehru criticized it. In fact, he even called it a coup, a palace coup. Obviously India was very unhappy with what had happened, because we were a new democracy. We had just overthrown the colonial yoke. A lot of Nepalese political parties drew inspiration from the Indian political process and the freedom struggle. And here was this king who was banning political parties and taking over executive power. And so India criticized this move. And in response to this criticism, the monarchy took a lot of steps. And then the hill identity, the king tried to consolidate his support amongst the hill people who were like him. He tried to balance India by, making overtures to China. He tried to reach out to the opposition groups or the people in India by declaring Nepal to be a Hindu state. Incidentally, Nepal became a Hindu state in its constitution only in 1962. And I was told by somebody who was involved in these processes at that time that this was basically because they felt that the government of India is critical, so why not reach out to the opposition and people of India in general, and hence Nepal was declared a Hindu state in 1962. So and the last thing, of course, was to say that India is giving shelter to Nepalese politicians. These are dalals, these are Indian puppets, and this is against Nepal, and so this whole concept of anti-Indian nationalism developed in Nepal, and obviously he also got the support of the, and also since maybe this is too much detail, but the democratic forces who had fought for removing the autarchical Rana rule, which was basically the Nepali Congress. It was like the Indian National Congress of that time. They went into exile in India. And so the king started promoting the leftist forces in Nepal, the communist forces in Nepal, to neutralize the influence of the democratic forces. And so this was the connection between the royalists and the leftists in Nepal. Their meeting point was their similar thinking about India, that India is a threat or of anti-India nationalism. And you see that to this day. Even in recent history, you see this connection between the leftists and some of the royalist forces in Nepal. So this is the context in which we really need to understand the psychology of Nepal and factor this into our own thinking and decision-making process, which sometimes we don't. I must say that in Nepal there's a very strong perception that there's a very patronizing attitude that India takes in Nepal, and they're very resentful of that. And I think it's it's true. You know, you sort of, you know, you assume so many things, and any relationship will stagnate if it's based on, you know, assumptions. I think you have to constantly nurture the relationship, which means make efforts, engage more, you know, to come back to what I said earlier. And it's very important to understand this psychology, I think, in order to succeed. Because if we don't understand this context and the psychology, I think we can go really wrong in the relationship.
Actually, I now remember where I was. I was in Chennai, and the reason I want to come back to this is because that's that question of, oh, you don't know what you want in your nation and what you want back in your nation, that someone can tell us, is also this strange nostalgia that sometimes India can have for the Nepal that it perceives it has lost through the loss of monarchy and Hinduism. एक ही तो हिंदू राजा था, एक ही तो विष्णु का अवतार था, एक ही तो हिंदू देश था, and there is a nostalgia for that in an Indian community, which when you express that nostalgia, you've forgotten that somebody else has fought to get rid of it. And I think that's coming back to your point of that can seem very patronizing and difficult to swallow. I remember sitting there with 5 people, all of them trying to convince me that that's not what I want. So finally I just said I will eat my food.
They knew Nepal better than you.
Absolutely knew Nepal better than me. And were more Nepali than I was, except none of them had ever visited. So, alrighty then. Do we have time, right?
So Smriti, tell us about, you know, one question I wanted to ask Smriti. She's saying, no, I'm going to interview. So she is of Madhesi origin and grew up in Kathmandu. And I was asking her, what do you look at, how do you look at yourself? Are you a Nepali first? Are you a Madhesi? How do you look at your own identity? And she's written a whole novel on this. So why don't you tell us something?
Well, thank you. So my grandmother, my nani, is a Nepali woman married to an Indian man. My dadi, my paternal grandmother, is an Indian woman married to a Nepali man. My father, of course, married an Indian woman, my mother. I am a Nepali, I have married an Indian man. So we've been doing zigzag, zigzag, zigzag the whole time. And yes, the roti beti is a very strong thing. So my nani is Nepali, my mother is Indian, I am Nepali, and my children are American. I don't want to talk about them, horrible people. So that is my strange dilemma, because growing up, I did not know how to define myself, and I was constantly getting defined by people around me. So when I came home to my nani ghar, where I spent most of my childhood, I would be part of the racial slur that India will throw at Nepal, and I would be called all kinds of things for being Nepali. And then I'd find myself defending Nepal and getting angry with the people I love very much. So I had this strange resentment towards the people I was closest to, and I felt that they didn't get me. And then when I was in Kathmandu, everybody would call me Marcia or Dhuti or Kale, which are all slurs for being Indian. And then I was constantly then defending myself against them and fighting with my best friend and saying, you don't get. So it was extremely confusing. Also, coming back to what Amish was talking about, is when you come to Kathmandu and then you go further and further north, the distinctions can be very sharp. Simply look at momo. Nepal is known for its momos, but momos come from Tibet, right? Nepal is also known for its dal bhat, which can make you feel very close to to India, but then but that distinction is very strong. You have the Thanka art, which comes from Tibet, from China.
Thangka went from Nepal to Tibet.
See, now you have to tell us that. We'll be talking about foreign stuff.
No. So basically, there is a Nepali style of painting which is called Pauba, which in turn is also so Nepali sculpture. There are multiple influences. So you can see Gupta influence. You can in the Lichavi times. Then later on, you can see Pala influence. From that, then you start seeing Pauba. From Pauba, then goes to Tibet, where it becomes Thangka, and then around the 16th century, Thangka begins to incorporate Chinese elements. So like the clouds, the swirly clouds that you see, they all come from China.
See, now that I learned something right here. I always thought it was the other way around. So I think for me, growing up in that kind of an environment, in fact, when I I'm married to a Tamilian. My neighbor, he came to my father and he said, "Why have you done this? This is, and my father is like, she wouldn't listen to me, that's why I've done this, but but the thing is, all these conversations are constantly happening. So I don't know, when you ask me who do I identify with, I don't identify as Indian, I don't identify as Nepali. I find it very difficult to identify as either, but I very strongly identify as Madhesi. And I identify as the privileged Madhesi who speaks English, because I think that has been my ticket to freedom, and it has been my ticket to not being discriminated as much as some of my other relatives have been. And for the longest time, I had a difficult relationship with the fact that I spoke English, taught English, read English, wrote English. But with time, I have come to realize that has saved me from so much power politics, discrimination, cultural difficulties, which had I been purely Nepali speaking, Hindi speaking, or Maithili speaking, especially Maithili speaking, I would have had to fight with. So, yes. Alright, I was going to show Thanka out here, if that's possible, because just how beautiful it can get.
Yes. I think we have time. Yeah, we can ask questions also.
Vikram Deshpande. A quick comment and a question to Amish. So this was regarding what you said about diffuse borders. So interesting conversation I had in Kathmandu with the Chinese DA. European Union, this is year 2000, and European Union was just coming about. And he made this very strong statement where he said that our borders civilizationally have united us. And the Westphalians who have imposed these nation states are now united. So that was the irony around the century. But the comment is that somewhere, I've read Sir's book, I'm sorry I've not read yours, I promise I'll read it tonight, and yours too. But the comment I was wondering, somewhere are we conflating this bridge of Nepal? The bridge of, I would call it a bridge. Not as Prithvinarayan Shah, and this is not an imperial definition. Prithvinarayan Shah called it a yam between two rocks. Are we conflating Tibet and China somewhere? Because that we have got to be conscious of that. I was just a second to both of you, sir. One of the things that struck me in my travel around Nepal is I never found a single CDO who was not, and you understand what I'm saying, who did not belong to a particular set of communities and did not belong to the middle belt, excluding a lot. So these subaltern narratives, are they one of the reasons why India is frowned upon? Because somewhere this kind of a monarchical feudal system has been associated with India, and this kind of a identity of, I saw a lot of gurus saying we are Buddhists. Earlier they would get conflated with Hindus. but we are Buddhists, and that kind of a distinction, as you travel north, started appearing more and more. So I would like both your comments on that.
Okay, no, so you're absolutely right. I think conflating Tibet and China, I see there a little bit more nuance over there, right? Because across the world, governments recognize Tibet as a part of PRC. So that is the political fact. Now, as a personal thing, what do you see? Of course, in history, historically, Tibet and China have had a very unique relationship. And from 1913 till about 1950, I personally consider Tibet as an independent state. Now, what the status is today, that is a different convention altogether. So, when we are talking about Nepal's border on the north, right, it is Tibet, but it is also the PRC. So, I think that is a distinction that I think, at least I've tried to make it clear in my book. I would, but there have been comments that I should make it clearer, because if you are talking about Tibet, then it should be whether you should include Amdo and Kham, or whether it's just Vecha, right? So that's one point. And the second point about, I mean, that is the whole thing, right? That the Nepali identity is considered to be a hill identity. And this hill identity actually is an exclusionary identity. Because you are not including not just the plains people, but also the high mountain people. But B, within the hill people also, there are gradations, there are hierarchies. So the hierarchies are obviously, I mean, this is one way of what we are talking about, that how, let's say, like, I mean, there is an Indian scholar from American University, and he wrote a history of caste in India, and he said that the British invented caste in India. And that's a very common concept nowadays, I'm sure a lot of you read. And I reviewed that book, and I said simply that if the scholar had simply looked beyond Indian borders and into the history of caste in Nepal, where in the 13th century a caste division had been framed down, you would have understood that caste was not a colonial invention. And these hill societies are Hindus, they are obviously hierarchical in nature. So the entire basis of nationalism of the Nepali identity is also in many ways one of hierarchies, right? Who is more Nepali? So it's a question of hierarchies. Within that hill identity also, there are multiple hierarchies. So the Khas Arya people, which is the Kshetri bounds, they consider themselves to be pure Brahmins, right? Or the pure Nepalis. But if you tell them that, boss, aap to Kumaon se aaye the, or aap Garhwal se aaye the, it's continuous migration. Like I said, the Himalaya has been historically, it's just been a place of migration. Yeah, some from Rajasthan, like the Shahs, right? They consider, the Ranas, they trace their thing to Udaipur, which is again a historical error. It was entirely a concoction, but yeah, like things like that. So when these hierarchies exist in society, that those hierarchies reflect themselves in how you see the world around you, and thus your neighbors as well.
Just a small point I want to make, and that is, while the monarchy has gone, I think this kind of feudal setup still remains. So you have replaced the monarchy by a dominant hill elite, and so nothing much has really changed. And I think what you experienced in 2000 is what I experienced in 2015 and 16. I think of the 75 or 77 districts, perhaps one or two may have been
that still is.
Yeah.
But I think increasingly what is also happening is that post 2015, again, contentious constitution, all of that, but post 2015, there is an increasing realization. So the identity movement in Nepal has been very, very strong since the 1990s, since post 1990. And post 2015 in particular, I think there has been a pushback, and there is in fact a protest going on right now in Nepal against a cable car that takes over, that's supposed to be going over the Rais and Limbu's sacred jungle, a sacred forest. And so that sort of pushback is more and more evident. And I think this is one of the, because we are a republic, we have fought for this republic, we can do this. Now, if we are a monarchy, we wouldn't be able to do this.
Anyone
Just one question. You talked about China and you talked about India. Now, there's a lot of talk about a third actor coming in from the West. You tell us a little bit about that third actor and the influence.
Well, the third actor is it's very uncertain because so many changes have happened in the third actor's own country that one doesn't really know where Nepal stands on all this. But yes, up to recently we saw this huge contest between the US and China for influence worldwide. And I think this also played out in Nepal in terms of competing projects, in terms of the two countries getting involved in each other's, in trying to prevent each other's projects from bearing fruit in Nepal. So there is, what I'm talking about is the Belt and Road Initiative on the one hand, which is a Chinese concept, and then the Americans had come with something called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and they were giving grants. And both these really got caught up in the domestic politics of Nepal and the political alignments of Nepalese parties with China or with the US. And the US and the Chinese governments and embassies became very deeply involved in trying to prevent the project of the other country from coming through. So we saw a lot of that in Nepal. We see, of course, a very strong footprint of China, a growing footprint. Most recently, the Prime Minister of Nepal went to China and they've signed a framework agreement on the Belt and Road Initiative. And that has national consensus because right now you have a grand coalition in Nepal of the Nepali Congress and the UML. These are the two largest parties and they formed a coalition government. So that is a major development. So it's kind of, it's this kind of jockeying for political space and influence is continuing. Earlier, perhaps it wasn't so evident, but I think this growing US-China rivalry has implied, much stronger US footprint as well in Nepal. I mean, the US has always been there since the 50s, but a much more active engagement now. And I think for India, it's, for India, of course, our stakes in the relationship with Nepal are perhaps higher than for any other country. And I think this has huge implications for our role and influence and relationship. And I don't think we should be sanguine of, there is a feeling that, we have a good relationship with the Americans, and so if the Americans and the Chinese are fighting it out in Nepal, it's going to benefit us. But I think that's a very, that's a very short-term perspective. I'm not so sanguine that, this will have good implications for India in the future. Because I think if you vacate space obviously somebody else will fill it in, and then it's very difficult to retrieve lost ground. Which is why I think I made the point about strengthening our engagement and across the board.
I think I'll just add to that, I mean, you're talking about, like ceding space. I think US is right now ceding space in a lot of countries because it especially Nepal as well, because it was the largest bilateral donor. The USAID had committed about a little bit more than $500 million in aid over the next 5 years. And USAID now, we don't know the future. So there is a vacuum that is going to come up. Now the question is, who's going to fill that vacuum? India has an opportunity here. China, of course, will always have an opportunity. So, like you said,
Just a query, not a question, exactly. Post-1990s, post the Maoist movement, the kind of migration that is happening to US and a kind of a diaspora literature that is emerging from that particular side. from Madam Smriti and from your talk, we got to know that there is so much diversity within Nepal itself, right? Regarding the question of belongingness, the question of identity. So, any one of you, if you would like to comment on that, how that diversity within Nepal, in terms of identity, now when it is being seen from the US, in terms of memory, diaspora writing, is it actually getting addressed, or just Nepali people migrating to US post 1990s, a kind of a stereotypical writing about home and homeland and the question of crisis, or whether these kind of diversities, I think it should be there in the literature. So any observation?
No, so a couple of points. I think the Nepali population, the diaspora in the US, a lot of them are still first gen. So first generation diaspora writing doesn't really it's very, very rare unless you are automatically privileged enough to go and study like to just sit and write in as a first gen diaspora, right? But yes, there are a couple of novels or writing, I would say, that is emerging. I think now most recently we have had Veena Pun, who's living in the US. She's recently written a novel about the Maoist war from a woman's perspective. So that, I think, is continuously emerging. I think the question of diaspora writing in Nepal is more particularly concentrated in the Gulf countries, in Southeast Asia, where you can see a majority of the people who are migrating from Nepal are going to these countries. So the US, yes, there's a large chunk that's going, but those guys are already the US is an expensive place to study to begin with, right? So that is an elite, you can say, you can call it a social elite. But real literature, or rather, I would say the more diverse, the more authentic writing in Nepali is mostly addressing a little bit like, I would say, Binyan in Malayalam literature, like good days. Yeah, so that would be a good parallel.
But what about people like Samrat Upadhyay
I mean, Samrat.
and Manjushri?
So Samrat's works, at least the early works, he used to write about. There was this nostalgia about 80s Kathmandu. I don't think he's written a lot about diaspora in the US. Manju's, I think there was one particular novel where she was tackling, I think, the emigration. I don't think. Seasons of Flight. Yeah, Seasons of Flight. Where, and now I had read it many years ago, so I don't really remember, but I think it was about traveling, right? But that was also based, she's also living in Canada now, so I think she's writing more books. So I'm sure, I think we will see, as with any diaspora population, I would argue that maybe another 5-10 years, I think we will see a voluminous amount of work that will be coming out from Nepali diaspora population across.
May I just, I don't know too much about the sort of literature aspect, but I think the diaspora has a huge impact in Nepal. And not just in terms of sending remittances, and so you have this consumption economy which seems to be booming, though the real economy is pretty stagnant and worrisome, but in terms of influencing political choices of their families back home. And so you can see new political forces emerging in Nepal. There's a lot of discontent with the established political leaders. Last 30 years, it's the same leaders, who it's like musical chairs. So now you have new forces that are emerging, and I believe one of the elements, influencing this is the diaspora, which doesn't vote in the election, but they get their families to vote for younger people. So that's a big thing. And the second element, if I might just say, in Nepalese art, for instance, there's a very talented young painter called Hitman Gurung, and he had a whole series on the migration of the Nepalese and the trauma that they faced in places like Qatar. And I remember, the World Cup stadiums in Qatar were basically built by labor from the Indian subcontinent. And they were working in temperatures like 55 degrees Celsius. And these, people from Nepal, hill people, who are not used to this. So a lot of young Nepali people die in this process. And so there was this thing about, how 2 coffins come back every day to Nepal. And so this Hitman actually had a whole series on this. which was a very moving. So there is a lot of engagement. Nepal is a small country, and 1/3 of the country is the diaspora now. Between India, the Gulf, the US, and other places, so they have big impact.
No, just one point that I wanted to say on the issue of political choices. There is now an increasing, let's say, question in the diaspora as well as in domestic Nepali politics about whether to allow the diaspora population to vote back home. So I think there is something similar happening in India as well, but in Nepal it is gathering momentum. And on Hitman Gurung, yes, he's an incredible artist. Another artist who you should check out is Sherin Sherpa. So he essentially is an Himalayan person, and he takes basically his father and his grandfather were Thangka painters, and he's taken that Thangka art form into modern art. So you are seeing these sort of expressions coming out in various, let's say, creative forms. And then there's, of course, recently there was this film called Shambhala, which at Locarno, the actress won the best actress. So these films are, so there's a lot of, let's say, creative expression, not just necessarily in writing, but in, let's say, these other art forms that are emerging from the diaspora as well.
I'm so sorry, but I can't resist this. How does the Nepalese diaspora look at the Indian Nepal? I'll give you an example. Vipul Chetri came out with a beautiful song, Jane, Siliguri, Kimi Jane, Signi Matira.
Yeah.
Whenever I hear it in Nepal, it gets transferred to Pokhara and Jomsom.
No, I think, so also has a question. No, I think, see, a lot of, in the diaspora, right, there is of course, I don't think there is a lot of understanding right now in terms of India-Nepal relations, in terms of, let's say, the nuance that it should bring, right? So there is, of course, and what you hear is usually from the internet. And internet is, I don't regard it as a perfect marker. But I think increasingly there is an understanding that, Nepalis are working with Indians, Indians are working with Nepalis, Indians are working, Nepalis are working with Pakistanis, across, in Qatar, everywhere. So I think increasingly there is an idea, there is a great understanding, at least inside Nepal, and perhaps in sections of the diaspora as well, that our politicians continue to blame India. That may not be necessarily correct. That may not be necessarily the true story. So they have begun questioning, because you are continuously saying that, all right, if you're blaming India for, let's say, oh, it didn't do this, it didn't do that, whatever like that, after the point that the population also realizes that you're being sold a story. So that story is being questioned, and hence the support for, let's say, newer political parties, newer political faces. Kathmandu's mayor today is a rapper. He's a 34-year-old rapper. How did that guy get elected? Of course, because there was discontent against, the existing political faces. That's how this guy emerged as a political voice. And today, perhaps, he is the most popular political leader in Nepal. Sorry.
Hi. Just a question for you, Amish, and another question for you, Ranjit. Amish, whether Nepal is a Hindu kingdom or not can be discussed forever, but Nepal is a Hindu country, by and large. Now, has that Hindu community in Nepal been contaminated by the elements in India, which are making Hinduism not only more aggressive, but more exclusive? I'd like to know whether the Hindu community in Nepal is suffering from the same problem. And Ranjit, I think my statistics may be out of date, but maybe Nepal enjoys the largest amount of Indian assistance going to any country. If that is still so, whether it's so or not doesn't matter, but it enjoys a very large segment of Indian assistance abroad. Now, do you think that that assistance has resulted in any particular dividend in terms of goodwill for India, or has it been money down the drain?
So I think in terms of goodwill, that's only one element of what goes to determine goodwill, and there's so many other factors, and sometimes, you know, they tend to neutralize each other out. So I think some of the large projects like big roads and so on, we built the Tribhuvan Rajpath, and you know, I've written about this as well. I remember driving on the Tribhuvan Rajpath, and I saw that, you know, there were plaques at various places. There was also a memorial for Indian, they were, I think, sappers who built it in the 50s, who had died. And most of these plaques had been defaced, or you know, were really sort of in a bad state. And I spoke to the minister in charge, and I said, you know, we'd be very happy to replace them, and after all, you know, this is a very strong connection. But there was no interest. So I think, you know, our sense, and you know, Amish might disagree with me, and you can correct me, is they want Indian assistance, but I think they also tend to resent the fact that they need or they want Indian assistance. And they certainly don't want to acknowledge it. And one other instance, you know, after the earthquake in 2015, India was the swiftest response, the Indian army. I remember there was a pledging conference in Geneva, the United Nations that hosted a pledging conference. And the Nepalese ambassador made no reference to the fact, you know, that India had made this massive sort of show of support to Nepal. So this is this very complicated fact. So in terms of money down the drain, I don't think so. I think it's benefited Nepal a lot, and I think it has led to much better connectivity between our two countries. And that's our approach, because, you know, if your long-term strategy is to, I mean, I use the term integrating the economies into a common economic space where everybody is free to sell and buy whatever they can produce, and this is the surest way of also improving your political relationship. So if you look at Indian assistance from that perspective, you know, building railway connectivity, road connectivity, digital connectivity, oil pipelines, so you're connecting the economy with hydropower projects. So I think this will cement the relationship in a way where it's very difficult then to extricate one country from the other. So, you know, I don't think it's money down the drain, but if we think that, you know, they'll be grateful and they should express great, you know, gratitude for what India has done, I don't think that is forthcoming. I don't even know whether that should be an expectation on our part.
I think certainly, with all respect to you, you've given a very diplomatic answer. I would say that even what you have said adds up to very little in terms of dividend, as far as India is concerned. Now,
Goodwill. In terms of dividend, if you define it as goodwill.
I'm not sure that that's a very pragmatic way of looking at it, but all right, I'll let it pass, because I think that that is the position I think that the government would take, which you've articulated very clearly. I think, in fact, though, a taxpayer is willing, or is perhaps able, to inquire whether this degree of assistance to a neighboring country has really resulted in anything very practical.
I think that is also the view that Musk is taking of USA. Yeah. But I think, I mean, I agree with sir. I don't think you have to necessarily look at it in terms of like
return on investment.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that you notice about Nepal, especially if you go into the smaller towns and all, is that the school buses and the ambulances will usually say donated by the government of India. And I think that makes a lot of difference. I think it's particularly evident in the smaller towns and Malays, as well as in the mountains and in the hills as well. Almost, and in fact, it is now, it will probably be a recurring joke in Nepal that if you want an ambulance, you can approach the embassy. So, yeah.
I need to comment on this a little bit. Sir, just to answer.
I'd like Mr. Amish to answer my question about Hinduism.
Okay. On Hindutva, I think, of course, open border, similar understanding, similar cultures, there will always be an influence. But we also have to remember that Hindutva has come to represent India, and like with most political things Indian, we are also rejecting it on that basis. Because it is not Nepali. It is not a Nepali political ideology. So if it is not, then if you're rejecting it, essentially you're saying that, oh, you're basically saying that Hindutva is an Indian ideology, so why do you want to import it? So it's not really made inroads into the hills so much, or the power centers, or in the political, let's say, discourse of every day. And apart from that, I think Nepal, despite being secular, is very much Hindu in its nature. I think the head of state, the head of state continues to participate in Hindu religious functions. I think the head of state is actually mandatory for a couple of Hindu religious functions inside Kathmandu Valley, which affirm the relationship of the state and the religion. So I think if these ideas already exist, which the head of state, which is currently the president, they took over from the king, right? So that the nature of the state is a very different than, let's say, the nature of the relations in India, between religion and state. So that concept, I think you have to sort of look at it from those perspectives. That when, of course, Hindutva is making inroads into Nepal, but I would argue that it is still a very, very marginal population. I think Hindutva is increasingly also seeing, like you said, it is seeing that it wants to align with the monarchy. And monarchy, the return of monarchy itself is not a very popular topic. So I don't see it being widely successful. I could obviously be wrong, because who knows the future. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, am I allowed that comment on what we owe Nepal? Yeah. Because I belong to the Gurkha.
Yes.
Let's not forget that people have played for,
We have paid, and I speak for all Nepalese, irrespective of which side of the border they belong to. They have paid for it in blood. So whatever we do for them is less.
Despite that, now what we are talking about connectivity and like engagements, right? Despite that, I don't think there is a single memorial to the Indian Gurkhas in Nepal. We have memorials to other, let's say, like regiments, but in Nepal, where is the Gurkha memorial? I mean, you're talking about goodwill, you're talking about dividend. We have to look at it from that perspective also.
Here, politics is at play. And I'll tell you something. So, in 2013, the elections to the second constituent assembly were to take place. So the government of Nepal needed a lot of human resources, for security of the booths and the ballot boxes and things like that. And there were at that time 125,000 pensioners from the Gurkha army, the Indian army, Gurkha pensioners. So I spoke to the Prime Minister. He was then called something else, the Indian killer.
Oh, Kimraj.
So I spoke to him and I said, sir, you have these, people who are well trained. And, instead of recruiting new people and training them, why don't you use this resource? But there was no interest, because there was always a suspicion in terms of the loyalty of these people. Since they had worked in the Indian army, would it be politically correct to use them for a sensitive issue like the elections? So, it's very much in the back of the mind, and maybe in retrospect, he took the right decision not using them, because had he employed them, and depending on the outcome of the results, you would have had a huge controversy. So, so these are some of the sensitivities. So, the way we look at Gorkhas in India is very different from the way the Nepalese look at the Indian Gorkhas who go back. For instance, not a single Indian Gorkha, despite the fact that they're well off, better off than their Nepalese compatriots. But nobody has come into politics. You don't see any of these ex-servicemen in, sort of other positions. Of course, their children and so on have done extremely well. And you'll meet many politicians who will say, my father and so on, uncles, etc. So there is this. It's a sensitive relationship, and there is this difference. So, whenever our people go to Nepal, we have these Gorkha rallies. When the President of India went, we had this huge get-together in Pokhara, and of course, we loved it. But you know what the Nepalese think of it, I'm not so sure.
So one last question, if there's any, and then I think we should wrap up. So I guess we can wrap up now. Thank you so much for this packed session.